Next up, we have Josh. He's going to be talking about, well, I'll let him dive in, but basically, Apple's claims about patching older operating systems, which, we've all been told to patch and keep updated, but, really what Apple says is sometimes different than the reality. So let's give Josh a warm round of applause.
All right, awesome. Here we go. Okay, so the title of my presentation is n-1 and n-2. Should we really trust in you? An examination of macOS security updates. And so the N, by the way, that we're talking about here is a placeholder for the current version of macOS 10, whatever that happens to be at the time. Currently, that is macOS Big Sur. The n-1 then is macOS Catalina, and the n-2 currently is macOS Mojave. Just briefly, I'm the chief security analyst at Intego. I've spent more than 20 years doing all kinds of different kinds of cybersecurity research, and I love doing it. And this is some of my latest research. Okay. So this is a little bit of what we're going to cover today. There's a few other things included in here, but we're going to go over really briefly a history of macOS security updates. What has Apple done in the past, and that can sort of give us an idea of what they're going to continue doing in the future. We'll talk about whether new macOS versions as they come out are inherently safer. We'll talk about the 400 plus Big Sur era vulnerabilities. Obviously, we're not going to get into a lot of details, but there are some pretty interesting ones that we'll talk about. And then how does all this relate to iOS? Of course, they share a similar code base. And, are there implications for iOS based on this research that I've done into macOS vulnerabilities? And we'll talk about some other things that we can take away from this, hopefully, regardless of whether you are a system administrator, whether you are an individual user, and are just curious about what you can do to improve your own security. We'll talk about some of those takeaways as well. Okay, so first of all, although the first Macs, and thus the first Mac operating system, were released in 1984, Apple, of course, made a significant shift in January 2001 when it released macOS 10. In November 2003, this seems to have been the first time that Apple released a security update for a previous operating system. macOS 10 version 10.3.1 was the latest at the time, but Apple released a security update for 10.2.8. Because releasing an update for an old OS was unprecedented, Apple actually made a statement about it at the time. And this is that statement. It is Apple's policy to quickly address significant vulnerabilities in past releases of macOS 10 wherever feasible. Now, that might be news to probably most of the people here. Like, Apple has actually made statements about their security patching policy. But they actually did. It was back in 2003, but they did make a statement about it. And to date, really, this remains one of the very few public statements that Apple has ever made regarding its security update policies. Unlike Microsoft, for example, they're very well known for announcing in advance, like, this is how long we're going to support our operating system. This is how long we're going to support this version of Microsoft Office. But Apple never says how long they're going to be releasing updates for a given operating system or software product. Exactly 1 month after Apple made this statement, Apple made another interesting statement along with the release of security updates for macOS 10 versions 10.3 and 10.2. And this is that statement. They say, note the following fixes which appear in these two security updates. They say, so the following fixes that are in the Panther update are not included in the Jaguar update. So this is 10.3 and 10.2 that they're talking about, macOS versions, since the Jaguar or 10.2 versions are not vulnerable to these issues. Okay, that's actually pretty cool. Like, I'm kind of wondering why Apple doesn't still do this. Like, this would be really, really useful information to have. But unfortunately, Apple no longer makes statements like these, which leaves open to speculation why some vulnerabilities don't get patched for some macOS versions, and we'll talk more about that later. So Apple followed a pattern of N and n-1 approach for many years from that point. They were releasing security updates typically for 2 macOS 10 versions at a time. And eventually, they started the practice of patching a few apps that I suppose were then considered maybe non-OS software, like iTunes and QuickTime and Safari, for also the n-2 macOS 10 version as well. But then Apple appears to have really solidified the n-2 support in September 2012 when they started releasing security updates simultaneously for macOS 10 versions 10.6, 10.7, and 10.8. Apple has followed similar practices ever since then for the current and 2 previous major macOS releases. Okay, so why do Mac users sometimes not upgrade to the latest macOS? There are a lot of different reasons. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on the user. In some cases, the user just doesn't think they really need the new features. Maybe they saw Apple's latest event, and they kind of go, yeah, none of that really impresses me. I'm fine with what I've got. Maybe they're concerned about something breaking when they upgrade, and those concerns might be well-founded because, for example, some people might know that, or they might have heard that they can't use their legacy apps anymore. Maybe it's some old version of Microsoft Office that they are still using for whatever reason. They just don't really want to pay Microsoft for the new version, and they have heard that it won't run if they upgrade to the latest macOS, so maybe they stay on the old version for that. Also, other Macs may not really be compatible with the latest OS. So if you've got an older model, you really may not be eligible to upgrade to macOS. Every other version or so, they tend to drop support for certain Mac models, whatever kind of happens to be on the list of devices that Apple now considers to be legacy or obsolete products. And so some older Macs simply just won't run the latest macOS, and some users are blissfully unaware. They're using an 8 or 9-year-old Mac, and they have really no reason to upgrade because it still works just fine for them, so they keep using it. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of Mac security myths, or at least assumptions that a reasonable person might make. Myth number 1, new macOS versions are inherently safer. Or in other words, by simple virtue of them being new, they must be safer, right? After all, Apple added new security features they told us about in a much hyped event, and they've presumably fixed all the known bugs, and so we have nothing to worry about, right? Well, not exactly. There have been a couple of really major snafus in Apple's macOS release history where they accidentally introduced some really egregious security bugs in a major new macOS release. Let's go back in time to the release of macOS 10.13, High Sierra. It shipped in late 2017 with a pretty terrible bug that became known as I am root. By simply typing root into the username field of a permissions prompt and then pressing return or clicking on the default button twice, you would actually enable the root account and set a blank password for the root account. This guy named Patrick Wardle right here noted that the root account could also be enabled remotely. Oops. Going back a little further in time, another memorable Apple security failure was the infamous go-to-fail SSL bug, which came to light in February 2014. Because of an erroneously duplicated line of code, OS X Mavericks treated broken SSL certificates as valid, enabling man-in-the-middle attacks. And then after patching this for iOS, which was also vulnerable, Apple took an additional 4 days before releasing a patch for macOS. Oof. Okay, so let's talk about myth number 2. All macOS security updates are created equal. One might reasonably assume that since Apple's releasing security updates for my Mac, once I install them, my Mac must now be perfectly secure, right? Even though I'm still on an older macOS version, I just got updates, so I must be secure. Well, as you've probably guessed by now, not exactly. In fact, it turns out that's pretty far from the truth. But how can we find out the truth of the matter? There are some pretty significant barriers that make it hard to get a complete and accurate picture of exactly how secure my version of macOS is. When Apple doesn't patch something for one or more operating system, as we'll see that they often do, is it because that vulnerability doesn't affect that OS for some reason? This isn't always clear, especially when dealing with proprietary or not well-documented Apple OS components. Apple hasn't made public statements about vulnerability applicability for many years, and Apple generally doesn't comment privately about such things either. Or perhaps, maybe Apple really did patch it, but they just forgot to mention it in the security release notes. That's possible too, right? Either way, Apple's silence means that we may have to rely on the vulnerability reporters, the researchers that Apple acknowledges, to help answer some of these questions for us. But even this isn't always easy. Many researchers report vulnerabilities anonymously. It may be difficult to find contact information for some of them, and there can be other challenges as well. On the bright side, I already knew some of the researchers who had been reporting vulnerabilities over the past year, so I at least had some place to start. But before I even knew what questions to ask researchers, I had to start compiling and analyzing data. So I carefully examined all of the details from every macOS security advisory since Big Sur was released to present. By my count, there have been 468 vulnerabilities that have been patched over the past year. So this is a shot of my spreadsheet that I put together. Obviously, it goes on much longer than this. But this is just an idea of what sorts of things I was looking at. And after organizing all of this data, I could see that there were definitely differences in what got patched for one macOS version versus another. After getting feedback from some researchers, I was able to clean up the raw data somewhat in cases where they knew that a vulnerability only affected certain macOS versions and not others. So let's take a look at some rough numbers. As I mentioned, there are 468 total Big Sur era vulnerabilities. And of those, 217 vulnerabilities were patched for all three of the currently supported operating systems, Big Sur, Catalina, and Mojave. 154 vulnerabilities were only patched in Big Sur. 74 vulnerabilities were only patched in Big Sur and Catalina, so N and n-1. 11 vulnerabilities were patched in only Catalina and Mojave. So if we're trying to kind of figure this out, it could either be that perhaps maybe Big Sur wasn't vulnerable anymore. Maybe they made some underlying changes and now Big Sur is not affected by whatever vulnerability may still apply to Catalina and Mojave. That could be. 7 vulnerabilities were patched only in Catalina, which, okay, again, maybe there's like something that was going on in Catalina's development where there's something that only affects that one operating system. That's possible. And also 2 vulnerabilities were patched only in Mojave. But this one is really weird. 3 vulnerabilities were patched in only Big Sur and Mojave. So you're telling me that there was a vulnerability in the oldest one, not the middle one, but also the next one? Like, how does that happen exactly? And of course, I reached out to Apple and asked these questions. I did not get an answer. Yeah. But there's one more thing. Sometimes Apple annotates a vulnerability with these words. They'll say, Apple is aware of a report that this issue may have been actively exploited. And specifically, this has happened 15 times since the release of macOS Big Sur last fall. Now, actively exploited is Apple's way of saying that these vulnerabilities have been used by actual attackers. So they've actually been observed in use in the wild or have reportedly been used in targeted attacks. So of those 15 vulnerabilities, 6 of them in red on this chart were patched for only Big Sur. 4 of them in yellow were patched for only Big Sur and Catalina. And 5 of them in green were patched for all of the currently supported macOS releases, including Mojave. Now, there's a little asterisk on that one because one vulnerability, the one that Cedric, Jaron, and Patrick spoke about a little while ago this morning, only applied actually to Big Sur and Catalina, so I'm counting it also in the everything got patched category. But obviously there's a lot of discrepancies here. Now, these are some of the most serious vulnerabilities, right? These are ones that we know somebody was actively exploiting. So why is there so much disparity among these actively exploited vulnerabilities? I think we need to explore those further. This is that list of 15 vulnerabilities. As you can see, many of these vulnerabilities were reported by people who chose to remain anonymous, which makes it nearly impossible to find out whether or not some of these may have only impacted the macOS versions that were actually patched. Unless, of course, Apple tells us, but, you know. Although, for WebKit vulnerabilities in particular, it seems like a fairly safe assumption that they probably apply to all OS versions. WebKit is a core framework used throughout the operating system, not just Safari. So it seems like Apple might want to patch in the wild WebKit vulnerabilities across all macOS versions and not just for Big Sur. But they're not, for some reason, at least in these 3 cases. But there's another vulnerability on this list that's made a lot of headlines recently. This one here, which Apple patched 2 weeks ago for Big Sur and Catalina, did not get patched for macOS Mojave. But the reason the vulnerability itself made headlines is not because it wasn't patched for Mojave, it was that it was one of the vulnerabilities used by the Pegasus spyware. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Pegasus, back in July, there was a leak of tens of thousands of high-profile individuals who were allegedly potential targets of this mobile phone spyware. Pegasus has been used to target business executives, religious figures, academics, NGO employees, union officials, and government officials, including cabinet ministers, presidents, and prime ministers, and more than 180 journalists that we know of. Pegasus often infects devices via zero-click remote attacks that exploit zero-day vulnerabilities. So getting back to that vulnerability that Pegasus leveraged, Apple didn't patch it for macOS Mojave. And also, it wasn't just a matter of Apple forgetting to document that it was patched, because there was no corresponding security update released for Mojave. So then the next question is, was Mojave actually affected by this vulnerability? I asked Apple, but of course they never responded to my inquiry. However, one person I reached out to did. Jinn is one of the unsung heroes of the Apple security community. By my count, he's tied with one other researcher for the highest number of vulnerabilities that Apple has credited to a researcher since Big Sur's release, 44 vulnerabilities. Mickey recently published his own independent analysis of this Pegasus vulnerability, so I asked him if he knew whether Mojave was affected by it. He confirmed that Mojave is indeed still vulnerable. Now, I'm not aware of any reports so far about this vulnerability being used against desktop computers, but now that multiple independent analyses of this vulnerability have been published, and Apple has chosen not to fix it for Mojave, it would be very easy for a malicious actor to take advantage of the opportunity. So you might reasonably ask, okay, but are there even a lot of Macs that are still on older operating systems? Well, you might be surprised. Although Big Sur and Catalina collectively make up about 78% of Macs being used online today, that means that more than 1/5 of actively used Macs is running Mojave or older. And that, of course, means that they're vulnerable to this or other serious vulnerabilities that may never get patched. Okay, so at this point you might be wondering about iOS. Does it have similar problems? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but there's a bit of a different situation with iOS. Currently, Apple is releasing patches for the newly released iOS 15 and iOS 14, interestingly. Even though it supports the same devices, Apple is kind of starting to do, I guess, the kind of thing that they have done for many years with releasing support to some degree for the n-1 version. But also, Apple is still patching iOS 12, kind of. Some older devices, first of all, are stuck on iOS 12. And this is actually why I think that Apple is still releasing some patches for that operating system. Some of those models include the iPhone 5, 6, and 6 Plus. There were a few iPad models. And you might think, well, I mean, do people really still use iPhones that old? Yeah, there still are people using old iPhones. And also, another really interesting one that is stuck on iOS 12 is the iPod Touch 6th generation. Now, this model of iPod Touch was actually discontinued only 4 months before Apple dropped iOS 13, which eliminated support for that model of iPod Touch. So if you had just bought the iPod Touch 6th Gen, like right before the 7th Gen came out, you got 4 months of security updates for it. Ouch. So I think that's probably part of the reason why Apple is still releasing some limited updates for iOS 12. But that's a key point there. They are limited updates. And based on the patch that Apple just released for iOS 12, I think it was last week, Apple seems to only be patching the actively exploited vulnerabilities in iOS 12. So all the other vulnerabilities, if Apple's not aware of them being actively exploited, they're not going to patch them for iOS 12, so it seems. iOS 13 is not getting updates anymore. iOS 14 is supposed to continue getting updates, and now iOS 15 is the latest, but it's missing 2 actively exploited patches that are found in iOS 14.8. I asked Apple again about this, and they didn't respond. Oh, yeah, so also that little animation was to remind me that if you happen to be running iOS 14.7 or older, or even if you've got iOS 14.8, you're not going to get prompted with a little badge like this to upgrade to iOS 15. I don't know if that's something that Apple is only going to be doing for a short amount of time, but for whatever reason, I had a device recently that was on iOS 14.7, and it did not give me a badge to notify me that there was iOS 14.8, which patched actively exploited vulnerabilities, and it also didn't give me a badge to let me know that there was a brand new shiny iOS 15 available. And I checked, and it's a lot of devices, actually, that are experiencing that. So I don't know exactly what Apple's plans are there. And for more details about what's going on with iOS security updates, we have some recent articles on the Mac Security blog that explore iOS further. Okay, so what can we take away from this? Generally speaking, the current macOS version is the safest one. Sure, yeah, there have been cases in the past where there's been some vulnerability that Apple introduced with the new version, but generally speaking, the latest is the safest because it gets the most total patches and they're the most important ones. Apple has a history of always fixing those actively exploited vulnerabilities, at the very least for the current operating system. So you probably want to avoid using the 2 previous versions of macOS as your primary macOS, like on your main computer that you use. And it's probably best to quickly upgrade to the latest macOS version. And if you happen to be using one of those 2 previous macOS versions, make sure that you don't assume that just because you're still getting security updates from Apple, that you're necessarily safe from serious vulnerabilities. They may not be getting patched. They may never get patched in some cases. And if you really need to keep a Mac on an older version of macOS for a particular app, it probably, again, shouldn't be your main Mac. Maybe keep that one offline, or don't use it as your machine that you use to browse the internet and things like that. So I know you probably have some questions. You want to know more about some of these vulnerabilities and what the list looks like. And so I'm going to be releasing all of that information. I'm still kind of compiling this, but we will be releasing a white paper soon with additional details. If you want to be notified when that white paper is available, you can sign up for a notification at the Mac Security blog, blog.intego.com. You can also follow me or Intego on Twitter to get notifications, because we'll definitely announce there once the white paper is available. And next up, I really wanted to thank the researchers who provided feedback. I couldn't have really done this without their help because, again, Apple doesn't really say much. And so these folks are amazing people who not only are they spending their time contributing and helping Apple to fix major bugs in their operating systems, but they also were kind enough to take the time to respond and help answer some questions related to this talk. So thank you very much to all of these really important folks for their invaluable feedback. And finally, thank all of you for listening to this talk. And I know there's a lot of people watching on the stream as well as here in person, and I couldn't be more happy for the time you've given me to share these thoughts with you. Thank you.